Come on and catch the excitement. It must be Saturday. Hey Colonel, hey Colonel, hey Colonel football. Coach Opie's here and it's a brand new year. Hey Colonel, hey Colonel, hey Colonel football. Come on people, we wanna hear you cheer. Catch the excitement. The tradition is clear. We're in Roy Kent Stadium, and we have no fear. Hey Colonel, hey Colonel, hey Colonel football. Coach Oak is here and it's a brand new year. Hey Colonel, hey Colonel, hey Colonel football. Come on people, we wanna hear you cheer. Hey Colonel, hey Colonel, hey Colonel football. Coach Oak is here and it's a brand new year. Hey Colonel, hey Colonel, hey Colonel football. Come on people, we wanna hear you cheer. Catch the excitement. The tradition is clear. We're in Roy Kent Stadium, and we have no fear. Hey Colonel, hey Colonel, hey Colonel football. Coach Oak is here and it's a brand new year. Hey Colonel, hey Colonel, hey Colonel football. Come on people, we wanna hear you cheer. Hey Colonel, hey Colonel, hey Colonel football. Hey Colonel, hey Colonel, hey Colonel football. Hey Colonel, hey Colonel, hey Colonel football. Hey Colonel, hey Colonel, hey Colonel football.
Good evening, Eternal Colonels, and welcome to our first ever virtual pub crawl, as we are going to stroll down memory lane tonight, and it's going to be a little bit different than your typical pub crawl because it's all going to be done right here online. We're going to go back in time and remember some of those great establishments during the next 5 nights that have made Richmond nightlife kind of the legend that it is, not only in Kentucky, but all across the region. We're going to talk about some of those places like Speck's, The Magic Moment, Poopy Yahtzes, The Family Dog, Jay Sutter's Mill, T-Bombs, Jerseys, even the Paddy Wagon, which is still open today. It's going to be a lot of fun. We hope you have a nice beverage. I've got my water, and we're going to bring in some folks who, some instances, these folks worked at some of these establishments. Other times it was just someone who liked to frequent these establishments, but it's folks who remember some of these great places and some of these historic, iconic places that every student who's ever gone to EKU certainly remembers about their time in Richmond. A couple of notes that we do want to tell you. Obviously, there's no way we could feature every one of those night spots over the years. So we've selected certain ones that we're going to feature, but we're going to do our best to try to mention some of the places that even aren't featured. We'll talk about some of the places that were also part of the nightlife when we do some of the segments throughout the week. So don't feel like your favorite bar, if it wasn't mentioned as a feature bar, we'll still try to talk about, still try to help you bring back some of your memories as well. We would like to make sure that you visit alumni.eku.edu/pubcrawl. And if you go there, then you can check in, and that will give you an opportunity to see where folks are from around the country that are tuning into our pub crawl, and also what event would be complete without a t-shirt. We have an EKU pub crawl t-shirt. You may have seen it there in the opening credits as it was scrolling across the scene. It's got some of these iconic night spots logos on the back of it. It says Eternal Colonel Pub Crawl on the front, and we are selling those. It certainly will be something that you'll want to add to your EKU shirt collection. If you're like me, over the years, you probably have a lot of EKU shirts, but this is certainly going to be a collector's item because it has everything from the 1960s spots to the present day spots, and some of the places that are still open and still serving the students at EKU and the people of Richmond even today. We also are going to give you an opportunity when you purchase your shirt to make a donation to the EKU Eastern Fund and help support EKU. Obviously, this has been a very trying time for our students. A lot of them have been met with difficulties in trying to continue their education. We are keeping campus as free of outsiders as we can during this period so that the students are as safe and as confined as they can be. And that's part of the reason we're having a virtual homecoming this year, to make sure that priority one for us is to make sure these students finish the semester and continue to progress toward their degrees. And even though we all want to get back together and be here in person together, the most important thing is that we get these kids through school and help them earn a degree just like you did at some point. So we're trying to keep campus free of as many distractions and as many outsiders and keep things as safe as we can for our current students. So over the years, obviously, there have been a lot of different spots and a lot of different places that we could have talked about, but we feel like we're really starting it off with the granddaddy of them all. And that is the club that started it, and it opened in the 50s and lasted all the way into the late 60s. And that was the famous Speck's Bar and Grill. And, you know, there are a lot of folks who have great memories. There have been Speck's reunions over the years. And some of the folks that we're going to be talking to tonight will be some of the folks who were there in the early days of Speck's and can remember what it was like. So we've got some great guests, and we're going to go ahead and bring in the guests, and we're going to get started and share a little bit about some of those memories tonight. So as we get ready to go, unfortunately, one of our guests is experiencing a little bit of technical difficulties, and I think we're getting very close on having that worked out. And hopefully he'll be able to join us in just a few minutes. But our guest tonight, first up, we have an EKU alum from the class of 1964. He was the drummer for the band, the Maroons. George Ridings is with us tonight. So George will be coming in. And there he is. George, welcome. George, we appreciate you being with us tonight. Also with us tonight, we have a member of the Exiles, the band that got its start playing some at Speck's and playing in the local scene. He was one of the original members and also later owned his own spots downtown with Jay Sutter's Mill and some others. We are very pleased to have Billy Luxon, who is with us tonight. So Billy is going to join us in the studio. Good evening, Billy, and welcome to the show.
Hello, Dan and George. How are you guys doing?
Doing good.
Good.
We're great and glad to have you with us. We also have J.P. Pennington, who also was a member of the Exiles and eventually Exile. And J.P. is the one who's having some technical difficulties right now, and they are still working on that. And we hope to have him join us in just a few minutes as he gets closer. But we'll go ahead and start the discussion. And then when J.P. gets here, we'll bring him in and let him get involved as well. So here's what I'm thinking, guys, tonight. I've got a couple of things I want to do. First thing I want to do, I want to talk about Speck's, because obviously that's where we're starting tonight. But I want to talk a little bit about Speck's and what made it the iconic place that it is. And then I want to talk a little bit about other places there may have been to go back then. Was Speck's the only spot, or were there other night spots around? And then third, I want to talk about the music scene, because obviously the music scene, and you guys know this better than anybody, was a very, very big part of Speck's. And there were a lot of bands that really kind of got their start and got their launch in that era from around this area. So George, I'm going to start with you, because I know you were a member of the Maroons and you guys were the house band at Speck's at one point, I guess. The club originally opened in the 1950s and it was owned by Speck Young, as I understand, correct?
That's correct. That's my understanding.
And then Frank and Joanne Nacita took it over, I would say sometime around 1959. And I think that's when things really got going for Speck's with the music scene. And you first were introduced, I guess, when you first came to school here, right?
Right. I come to Richmond from Middlesboro, Kentucky in 1960, fall of 1960. And my first encounter with ever seeing a band in a nightclub, I guess that's what I thought Speck's was a band, and the leader was named Nicky Zane. And the drummer was Chuck Campbell, which I'm mentioning that because that's the person that got the band started that was prior to the Maroons, but eventually become the Maroons. And so my start was the drummer for the first band that Chuck Campbell was the lead singer. And so that was my introduction, and was fascinated, I guess, with hearing the band there and the kids and all the fun everybody had.
The thing that's funny to me, or stands out to me about Speck's, is as I hear people talk about it, it was far from a fancy place. I mean, I've heard people compare it to a warehouse kind of look even. it wasn't anything super fancy. It was just, that's where everybody was back in that day.
Well, it had a tin roof. I can remember the tin ceiling, and it was very old, an old building, still standing as a matter of fact, but they had a jukebox in there for when the bands weren't playing. And we would start playing on the weeknights. It was Thursday night. And kids would come in, and we started playing at 7, played from 7 to 9. 5 till 9, the girls had to be in the dorm at 9 o'clock. But our band played, and one of the comments was that what they remember is the smoke-filled room and a lot of happy feet, because everybody was dancing shoulder to shoulder. And that's the good memories about Speck's.
Now, Billy, obviously you are someone who's been around Richmond for pretty much your whole life, I believe. And so what are some of your earliest memories of Speck's and your first encounters there?
Well, I remember going there when I was about 16, maybe. And if you knew exactly how to slip past the door people, you could get in. But ironically, George and the Maroons were my idols and our band's idols. And so we used to go down there every night they played that we were in town and listen to them and basically idolize them because we really looked up to them. They were a little bit older than us and much more experienced. We just basically gotten started. So I really vividly remember the Maroons on stage, and they were a fantastic show band.
George, tell us a little bit, who was in the Maroons back then? Who were some of the guys that got started with your band?
Well, like I say, the original group of us included Chuck Campbell, and the lead guitar player was a fellow by the name of Ray Linville. And we had a saxophone player, we called him Beak, because he had a kind of a big nose, but Beak Campbell. And Larry True and I were roommates, and Larry played the bass guitar, and I ended up involved in being the drummer. And that started, and we actually called ourselves the first few months, we were the Impressions. Of course, there was another big famous band called the Impressions. So I think somebody called Chuck Campbell's hand on that. We had to change the name, and trying to come up with a name, somebody come out and said, well, the Maroons, we're from Eastern. And I think it had to do with the Western. The Hilltoppers that were very famous and made it big time were from Western. So we were the Maroons, and people used to ask me, well, what is a Maroon? You never could tell anybody what a Maroon was other than their school colors. But our band, the year 1963, the year of 62, 63, 64, Gary Edwards had lost his band. He had a good band, but we needed a singer, and Gary Edwards. And when we really started playing and sounding pretty good, I think, that band with Gary Edwards and the Maroons and Tom Collins on the organ, Bill Ralph was the lead guitar player, Dave Osborne was the lead singer and a backup singer, and we had John Anderson was the saxophone. And we all just kind of melded together and could make sounds that were just all the old rock and roll songs and the Beatles songs when they come along. And so that's the Maroons. We played a lot of places, but Frank DeCita was so good to us. We played every Thursday night. We'd get $6. But then if we didn't have a job, he'd let us play on Fridays sometime. But there were other bands. There was a band named Monza that would play sometimes on Wednesday nights. So my memory is that it was really going big time. They played Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, and Saturday. And Friday and Saturday, most of the Eastern students went home. But those were the nights that more kids come from Transylvania, UK, Berea College, Cumberland College, from all around. As the word spread, the place to go have a party was at Richmond at Speck's.
Yeah, one of the things that I've heard about Speck's is not only did they have the music scene and that kind of stuff, but they served food, right? They had a pretty good menu of food.
Oh yeah, they were famous because they had Uncle Charlie's Meats, and they had some of the people talked about that I've visited just in the last few days about the ribeye steaks and country fried steaks and all the food that come from Uncle Charlie's. But hamburgers, I can remember that is very reasonable. But playing in the band, we'd get $6 a night. We thought we were rich because we were getting $3 an hour. We played 2 hours. The girls, like I say, had to be in the dorm at 9. But back then, you know, the beer, when I first started, the beer was 25 cents. But Gilbert Hale, who was the doorman, who's really very knowledgeable about Speck, said it was 35 cents when they got later. And they sold more beer there at Speck's than over the counter than any other place in the state. He said on a good night, they'd sell 50 cases of beer.
Oh, wow.
Billy, that's that's probably a lot.
A lot of beer.
Well, and one of the things too about Specs that people may not realize is there was no hard liquor, right? It was beer only, and the women were not allowed to sit at the bar.
That's correct. Durward reminded me that the women could sit in the booth, but there was a state law that women in the early 60s were not allowed to sit at the bar. And I told my granddaughter that today, and she said, well, discrimination. Even back then, I said, it was just the times, and it was the way Specs was run, very respectful, went by the law. There was never any trouble that I ever encountered at Specs. If someone had a little bit too much to drink, they would be escorted out. And it was a very safe place to be, and dancing. And as I told somebody earlier, I don't know how the place kept from falling in, because I can remember when we used to have to play shout and jump up and shout, and everybody's jumping up and down and the place is bouncing. And I know Billy experienced that too there with the Exile, but the place was just beautiful, and you didn't have to have a smoke machine like these bands do when they put on shows today, because everybody back then smoked. Blew haze in there, but it was just a fabulous atmosphere for students to have a good time.
You know, I've heard. Go ahead, Bill.
I was just going to say the layout was half of it was actually the restaurant part, and then the other half was the dance part. So on the nights that George is talking about when the bands played, both sides were totally packed. Though early in the evening, they had a pretty good dinner crowd. And like George said, they had, you know, steaks and burgers and all that. And I remember Frank had a really good sausage and pepper dish that he served that was really good. But they were a legitimate food place as well there early on anyway.
And one of the things you said, George, and I want to touch on this for a minute, that it really was a very friendly atmosphere. And I think you kind of alluded to this, but one of the reasons is that you didn't want to get in trouble at Specs and get banned, because if you got kicked out of Specs, your social life was ruined.
Well, and Durward Hale reminded me that there were no fraternities or sororities, and Specs kind of become a place to meet your friends and eat and dance and have a good time. And Durward reminded me that there was a stamp he'd put on everybody's hand, and if you were under 21, you got a stamp that said Specs. If you were 21 or older, I think he said it was first edition or limited edition, and that was the people that could legally buy beer. But back then, there wasn't a lot of enforcement, and so most of the kids that were there were beer. There was no drugs, there was no hard liquor, and I can't even remember ever being where we had to quit playing because of a fight or anything, but I think there was some activities outside, and it's usually over a girlfriend or somebody had a little bit too much to drink, but very seldom was there any trouble on the inside at Specs.
I don't know if they had these when you were playing, George, but eventually they had like lifeguard chairs in the back room in the dance part, where they had 2 bouncers, one on each side, that sat in those chairs, and they could look out over the crowd. And if anybody attempted to start anything, they were on it before it ever got started. So I think that was pretty preventable as far as having any trouble occur. And then also when the police would come in, which was occasionally, but not often, they would turn the lights on. And that was everybody's cue that if you have a beer, you're not supposed to have one, you better abandon it. So they kind of gave everybody a heads up that, hey, watch yourself here. So that also, I think, helped to keep the place under control.
Yeah, well, and you mentioned this earlier too, George. The Thursday night was the night for the EKU students, and then when you got to the weekend, it was usually the out of town students who would and people who would come in for specs.
Yeah, well, the student Eastern was known as a suitcase college, and if you didn't have anything to do on the weekend, you usually went home, and most of the students went home, which was always kind of unusual. But my freshman and sophomore year, I was very loose, but then I got married between my sophomore and junior year. And after that, I lived up in Brockton, but still played in the band and had a big time. One of the things I was going to let you all have to put on my glasses is tell me about the beers that were famous back then, and Pabst Blue Ribbon was one of the big ones. But let me read these names to you because it's so different today. Wiedemann beer was big, Fall City, Hurdles 92, Miller High Life, Colt 45, and Schlitz. And Schlitz, I think, was made famous by Mr. Jim Neal, who was always sitting at the bar in the afternoon every day. And I used to really wonder about that older man sitting down there at the end of the bar when we'd be down there to practice, say at 4:30 or 5 o'clock sometimes, because we couldn't play on campus. We were barred. The Maroons could not play any dances on campus because the rule was they were afraid if they heard us play it on campus, they'd want to come down to Specs. And I don't know how that rule got started, but I later told Bob Martin about it. And he said, well, I can't believe you as a drummer in a rock and roll band. Anyway, we've had a lot of fun over that. But those beers, you don't hear of those beers today. But Durward said Mr. Neal would drink 3 beers, 3 Schlitz, and he walked home. And part of this story is Dorman said he was Speck's most loyal customer. When he was 100 years old in a nursing home, Jimmy Barnes, the mayor of Richmond, took him a 6-pack of Schlitz beer, which I didn't even know you could still get it. And they had a picture of him drinking a beer at age 100 and the biggest smile on his face, remembering those Speck days. Now, that's quite a story for a man that lived to be 100 and still enjoyed a Schlitz beer. So I think he made a comment he couldn't get that at the nursing home. They had to stick it in. So that was kind of a funny story. And I did get to know Mr. Neal later on in life. But anyway, just a lot of good fun memories.
Well, a big part of what made Specs, I think, was Frank and Joanne. And I've heard, we lost Frank not too long ago, but I've heard so many stories over the years about the generosity from Frank and from Joanne for EKU students and for some of the people who came into Specs. I mean, it's very well known and documented out throughout the years that a lot of kids were able to stay in school because of the help they got from Frank and Joanne.
Well, I know that for a fact because one of our band members was getting ready to have to leave school, and Frank gave him some money and said, you can pay me back when you can. Will that help you stay in school? And he said, well, yeah, that'll help me. I can pay my bills. And that's a true story. But Durward said that he paid the help $1 an hour. Now, back then, my wife worked at the hospital as an x-ray technician. She got $1 and a nickel. So being $1 an hour working there, and he said they usually work 4, 5, 6 hours. That was enough money, and that $6 we got each week was enough you could live on it for a week because we had all those good eating restaurants, and you could eat for $1, $1.25, just about anywhere in Richmond. And but Frank and Joanne both, and Joanne was there a lot. They were so good to the students. His story, we talk all night about Frank and Joanne to see about the sport of Eastern. And I can see Frank's big smile right now. You never met Frank, what he wasn't positive and wanting to help students and Eastern. And he sure helped us because we didn't have a Friday or Saturday night job and they didn't have anything going on at Specs. He would let us play there and pay us. And he might lose money that night if there wasn't a big crowd. But that's how generous he was to students and his bands.
A bit of trivia, right at the end of Frank's ownership, he was the police chief of Richmond. And I don't know if that's why he wound up selling it and moving on. I'm not sure. but I always thought that was just kind of strange that he was the police chief and owned the biggest college bar in town.
That's right.
These days that wouldn't cut it, I don't think.
Yeah, that probably wouldn't happen today. Hey, I do have good news. JP was having technical difficulties, couldn't get connected. So he wanted to be with us so much tonight that he's jumped in his car and he's on his way here, driving over to Blanton so we can get him on the show and he can be a part of our discussion tonight. So hopefully he'll be joining us in just a few minutes. George, you mentioned the Good Eats, and I've heard tell that there was a restaurant maybe called the Golden Rule that wasn't too far away from Speck's.
Well, it was in the same block, and the fellow said at the door, his name was Rummy. They had the best rolls there, and Durwood reminds me that you could get a full meal there for 94 cents. And I don't even know if it was sales tax back then, but what he meant was by that, you work 1 hour at Speck's, you had one good dinner. But we had so many good restaurants, of course. Everybody remembers Ma Kelly's, but Bale's Restaurant, the Sweet Shop, Shepherd's Pool Hall. I know I'm leaving a lot of them out, but they were wonderful eating places, very reasonable, all over downtown Richmond. And that's one of the things we miss. And we had 2 pizza places that were real famous pizza places. And I'd never had a pizza till I come to Richmond. Middlesboro, Kentucky, if they had pizzas, we didn't have it. My father was a policeman also, and he was chief of police in Middlesboro when I left to come to Eastern. But Richmond was just like going to another world when I left Middlesboro to come to Richmond and the university. And how I ended up being a rock and roll drummer, I'll never know. It's just one of the greatest experiences. And Speck's was part of that because of all the treatment we had. It taught you discipline. You had to show up. It was hard work, but I enjoyed every minute of it.
Well, I remember the Sweet Shop even. It was still around when I came along as a kid. I can remember eating at the Sweet Shop, and it was great food. And you're right. What about, we talked a lot about Speck's, and what were some of the other places? And Billy, you may know some of the other night spots, maybe not just in Richmond, but in the area. If the band wasn't playing at Speck's on a night, where could people go to find live entertainment?
Well, in Richmond, I don't believe there was another place. But there was a place down at Clay's Ferry called the Jolly Roger, and they had live music there. I believe it was only on weekends though, but they did have live music. And at a certain point, some Eastern students kind of started patronizing them. But basically in Richmond, you had Speck's, which was the big college place, but you had a place out on East Main called the Red Barn. And that was eventually the Maverick Club, where that was, but not many Eastern students went there. You had another place called the 007 Room and the Library Lounge. Those were up on Main Street, and college students would go in there, but once again, Speck's was really where everybody went. So Dirty Ernie's was another place. It was more of a grill, but a lot of people drank a lot of beer there, in addition to hamburgers. But I don't think back in that time that a lot of EKU students really went to Lexington, or at least I don't remember going. But Speck's was the biggie at that point. Now a few years later that changed a little bit, but when George is talking about that time frame, that was Speck's was it.
Well, I remember there was a place down the street that tried to get started called the Paddock.
Yeah.
And Larry True reminded me that we played there a time or two. I don't remember playing there a whole lot, but there was another place, Billy, out on East Main Street, because we played there some on the weekends and kind of used it as a place to practice, called the Showboat.
Yeah, that really goes back. Yeah,
out there where the Maverick Club is, and I'll tell you the reason we go out there much, because a lot of those places were older people. They were, I don't want to use the word rednecks, but they were people there, and they had a tendency to drink too much and a lot of fights, and they kind of was against Eastern students and would get in trouble. And Billy's either fell out of his chair, his screen's gone black. We might have or something, but we played at a place halfway to Lexington called Circle H Bar down on the river. And that was a place we did play quite a bit on weekends, on Friday nights, and we'd get more money than we would get there at Speck's. But that was a pretty big night spot, Circle H Bar.
And the Maroons played a lot of weddings and proms and things like that.
Well, we played, a lot of high school proms, but we played fraternity, sorority houses over at Lexington Center College. We would play there. We played down in Lebanon, Kentucky a few times. Now, they played there quite a bit after I graduated in May of '64. And I didn't play a whole lot of times in Lebanon, but Club 68, I think it was. And there was 3 places there owned all by Mr. George. I think he was the mayor of Lebanon.
He was. The other one was the Golden Horseshoe.
Yeah, Golden Horseshoe. Did you all play there?
And then the Cherry Club. That was the other one he owned. Yeah.
Yeah, that's my memory. But I'm like you. There, most of the action, the people come from Lexington. The students come to Richmond for Speck's because of the way that it was run and the dancing and just a good time by everybody. And I think the town and the enforcement of the drinking laws, right or wrong back then, you could get a beer if you got in, because I think if you served food, 18-year-olds could get in, but you weren't supposed to be able to get beer until you had to be 21, I believe, Billy. Is that right?
That's right. But you could always find somebody who was 21 to buy you a beer.
And that's what I remember happened. Just about everybody there to drink a beer too, but it's just the whole thing that I remember about Speck's was how respectable everybody was at the time. And I'm sure there's a few people who would drink too much, but as I say, when I've talked to people that remember Speck's, they remember the thick smoke, the shoulder-to-shoulder dancing, and when the girls had to leave at 9 o'clock, the place would be deserted almost, and all you'd have was the boys left and a few girls, I guess, that didn't live in the dorms. But we would quit at 9 o'clock, and when we quit, it was pretty much over.
Yeah. You know, Speck's was really, I think, a very important venue for the bands, because you had people from all over Eastern Kentucky for sure, and Central Kentucky as well, coming in there. And so the exposure factor was just great. And we really look forward to playing there, because we only played on weekends occasionally when the Maroons weren't playing there. But Thursday night was the big night, and that's the night we aspired to play on. And Frank had at one point told us that if ever the Maroons left, that he would keep us in mind for the Thursday night slot. And what happened is everybody from Eastern Kentucky would come to Speck's. They would go back home and tell their high school or whoever that, hey, this band is really great. They're from Richmond, and you ought to contact them. So George alluded to that earlier, that they got a lot of jobs out of it, but I really consider that responsible for our spread and popularity around the eastern part of the state, because it was invaluable, the number of jobs and exposure that we got there. It was just a really great venue.
Well, and the thing to remember too, that some people may not even be thinking about is the interstate didn't come along until well after this, right? They were still driving 25.
Right.
Early 70s, I think.
70s, yeah.
Late 60s, early 70s. There wasn't no interstate. Our car going north-south had to come right through the middle of Richmond. And,
yes.
But one of the jobs we got that we were excited about, we played at the Princess Festival at the Mountain Laurel Festival, which that was pretty big stuff back in that day. That Mountain Laurel Festival, the Queen and a crowning of that, and we played a big dance there. I think we had to really dress up big time, because that Princess Ball on Friday night was a big thing, and then they had a great big ball. I think they had a big name, some kind of band. It was a big band, not a rock and roll band, but on Saturday night. But I can remember that job as being one for some reason I remember it, and I guess being from Bell County in Middlesboro, that made me remember it. But I think that's how we did get a lot of our jobs. And then Gary Edwards had a lot of contacts, and we stayed booked somewhere just about every weekend. And sometimes we'd play Thursday night, Friday night, and Saturday night. And come Sunday or Monday, we were worn out. But we were so happy to get the money, and we needed the money, and that was our spending money going to school.
Yeah. What about, George, what about vocalists for the Maroons? Who did most of the vocals, and did that change much over the years?
Well, the vocals, like I said, the first lead singer that I played with was Chuck Campbell. And Chuck was a music major at Eastern. He was a fabulous drummer. But when I first met him, he was the drummer with this Nicky Zane band. And somehow, and Larry True and I both can't figure out how it happened, but Chuck formed a band and asked me and Larry to play in the band. And then we had backup singers. One of that was played with Chuck Campbell named John Moore. And another one was called Jim Hutcherson. And that was the time back then, if you remember in the 60s, all these rock and roll groups had a lead singer and usually three they would harmonize, and like 16 Candles and all those type of songs that you still hear on the internet and you can get them. And that's what we tried to imitate. But then Dave Osborne come along, and Dave was one of the top singers. And unfortunately, Chuck Campbell has passed away. Dave Osborne has passed away. And then the main lead singer was Gary Edwards, and he's now passed away. So we've lost the three people that was lead singing when I played have all passed away. And appreciate being able to discuss this about this, the band. And they were kind of the leaders of the band, being the lead singers. But Bill Routh and Larry True and myself and John Anderson still all alive and can remember these things. A person that you need to get involved one time with these stories is Dewey Pope, because when I graduated in 64, the Maroons they kept going for a year, but then everybody, as they graduated, they ended up, they wanted to go to California. And that's when Dewey Pope became the drummer with the Maroons, but then they changed the name to Action Unlimited. And that group was in California, played with some big name bands, and really they were just, all they needed was some kind of break to be in the big time, and they were out there at the big time. But it's so tough to break in. But Dewey Pope knows all that, and he wrote a book. It's got all that in it. And also Randy Westbrook wrote a book about the Exiles. It talks about how they started at Speck's. The Maroons were involved. The band Monzas was involved, and the different groups that played at Speck's led to them being able to try out for Dick Clark and be part of the Dick Clark Caravan. And Billy and them, the Exile, become into that also. So when in 1964, when I graduated, I had to quit playing the drums because I went into the insurance profession, and they didn't want me hanging out in bars, I think. So that's my background.
Well, ironically, that's when Exile really got their break, and their start was when Action Unlimited left to go to California, because Frank called one day and he said, I think I'm going to be able to let you guys play on Thursday night. And we just thought maybe you guys had a job somewhere. He said, no, they've moved to California, and I'm going to let you all take over Wednesday and Thursday nights. And that was what I think really gave our band a big boost, and certainly changed the game for us. But I wanted to also give a little trivia about Speck's, which I don't know if a lot of people know, but Kilburn Cormney owned Speck's, owned the building. And Kilburn was a very successful businessman who eventually owned the Continental Inn in Lexington. And I believe he owned the La Flame, but there was another well-known restaurant over there I know that he owned. But he had a vending company in the basement of Speck's where they serviced jukeboxes. And back then, like George pointed out earlier, jukeboxes were the common form of music in all the bars and restaurants. And I think he had the only vending business in the this part of the state. He was a very successful businessman. So he actually opened it and had Speck Young running it. And so Speck ran it for, I don't know. Do you know, George, 2 or 3 years maybe? Or
I
I'm not
don't
sure.
really know. I'm not sure.
Yeah, I don't know how long, but it wasn't too long. And then Frank and Joanne came in. But Kilburn Cormany was really, he's a legend in Lexington. And he was originally from Richmond. So
Yep.
he basically was very successful. But that's kind of where that came from. And then when Frank got out of it, Bruce Billingsley bought it. And Bruce was the son of the manager at Newberry's in town. And he was a younger fella, and I believe he had been in the service. So he came in and took it over and ran it for, a couple of years at least. And then he sold it to Larry Pinson, a fella from Pikeville, who changed the name of it. And it was then the Stakeout, Steakout. And Larry was a pretty intimidating kind of a person, big old fella, and kind of gruff. And he would stand around down there, and people thought he was, I don't know, that he was an ABC agent or something, but he scared everybody. And honestly, I think he ran a lot of the crowd off because the place was thriving until he took it over. But he was trying to serve a lot of, upper level steaks and things like that. And that didn't work for him. And he basically turned it into just a bar. And he really couldn't make it. I think he just didn't do enough business, once again, because it just didn't have that atmosphere. He was a strict kind of a fella, and people just didn't feel comfortable in there. And so he closed it. It closed and was closed for, I don't know, maybe a year or so. And then Robbie Robinson bought it. And Robbie applied for a mixed drinks license, which were just newly available. And he got mixed drinks. And he named it the Family Dog. And as you know, it was a very successful operation for several years. And he even had a restaurant that was very successful downstairs, down below, called Paco's. And Robbie was there for several years, and it finally became impossible to operate a bar in Richmond because of the ABC and the laws that prevailed. And so Robbie, like the other college bars at that time, closed and never reopened. He still owns that building. But and I think from time to time he's had another concept open in another building he owns on 2nd Street. But I think basically that changed the whole scene in Richmond, was when the ABC from Frankfurt came in and started enforcing the laws instead of the local police in Richmond.
Yeah, and we're going to talk about that. Billy, you're nice enough to come back on Wednesday and be our guest, and we're going to talk a little bit more about the 1980s and into the 90s and when some of this stuff happened. And we're very fortunate. We've got Morgan Robinson Varney, who is Robbie's daughter,
Yes.
who's going to be with us Wednesday night to talk about the dog. And you're going to talk about setters, and we have some more stuff like that coming up later in the week. One of the things that one of our viewers was talking about was some of the dress back then. What did the kids wear? And certainly you've seen how kids dress when they go out nowadays. And, I'm sure it's obviously a lot different. But what was the attire back then? When the college kids would go to Speck's, how did they dress up? What did they wear? Did they dress up, or did they go casual, or what did it look like?
George, you tell him about the first part, and I'll tell him about the second.
Well, being in the band, I would get there and we'd start playing. And to be honest, I didn't pay a lot of attention, but I don't believe there was any short shorts. And I think they all wore long pants. And the girls, I think back then, had dresses or maybe slacks. And I wouldn't call it dressed up, but they were a lot more dressy than what you see the young people today. And because they were going out and they didn't want to be, I don't think there was a code as such.
No, I don't think there was.
But people dressed fairly nice. Now, they may have wore blue jeans, but but we as the band, we wore a uniform. We had maroon blazers. We wore nice dress up outfits when we played it. Well, everywhere we played, but we went out of our way to look nice. And I think the kids, students looked nice also, as that's what I remember.
Well, by the time we got there, it was mid 60s, 64 right through there when we actually started playing there. And the hippie movement had pretty much moved in and taken over. So the dress was much more casual, and you did see a lot of, faded blue jeans and halter tops and things of that nature. But I think the dress came down a notch when we were there from when you were there.
Well, and really some of the hairstyles, Billy, from that era. I mean, I've seen some of those old pictures of Exile and the Exiles, and the hair is one of my favorite pieces there.
Yeah. We got a lot of notoriety out of that, I can tell you, around this area.
Well,
a lot of people didn't like that.
What was strange?
Well, I got
strange.
let me
had burr haircuts. I had like a flat top bare, But when the Beatles come along, we actually would do a set of Beatles songs, and the singers would put on wigs to have the long hair to imitate the Beatles. And I can remember that because we all were short-haired people back in the early 60s. And
yeah, I remember John Anderson in his wig.
Yeah.
But yeah. And I wanted to add something else too, George. I think you didn't mention it, but Dave Osborne was a wonderful trumpet player as well.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, he was really a great trumpet player and an idol of mine.
He was a showman.
Yes, he was.
Dave Osborne if there was something went wrong technically, he could get on the microphone and keep the people entertained while they were straightening out something. And I can remember that. And same thing, Gary was able to do that also. And it can't just be anybody that can go up to a microphone and start talking in front of a big crowd and keep them from getting restless. And
yeah, well, let me jump in here real quick because you brought me to a good spot to do what I need to do. First of all, the good news is JP is here. So JP is going to come in and join us, and JP doesn't need much introduction. Of course, he was part of the Exiles and eventually with Exile, and there he is.
Hey, everybody.
Hey, man.
I apologize for my tardiness.
We're just glad you made it. Yeah. But we were talking about George was mentioning not just anybody could go up and go up in front of a mic and perform and could turn it on. And Billy and JP, you guys can particularly talk about Jimmy Stokely. I mean, if there was ever anybody who was made to be a performer, I think it would be Jimmy Stokely.
Well, you're right. I think in the early days, we were called the Exiles then. I think Jimmy pretty much was the band. That's who people came to see. They just wanted to see what he was going to do next, And he was the consummate performer. He had no fear of anything. And I think that was Jimmy's secret. He wasn't scared to try anything or do anything. And we were awfully lucky to have him. We really were.
Yeah, I think a lot of people came to see his ambidextrity. He was just, he could bend over backwards and touch his head on the floor and do the splits, and he would climb all over the speakers and tables, and people were just there to see that show. In fact, he was doing Mick Jagger moves before Mick Jagger was doing them.
Yeah, he was.
Jimmy had never seen Mick Jagger. And when I first saw Mick Jagger, I said, that's a lot like Stokely.
Mm-hmm.
So he just naturally had that ability.
They usually come to see what he had on too, because he wore some wild costumes.
Yeah.
He'd have a 3-foot feather with in a headband, and he had one outfit called a cricket outfit. He had these earth boots that came up to his knees, and these spandex pants and a velvet, some kind of velvet top and a headband with a peacock feather, coming out of the side of it. That was part of Jimmy's thing too, is how he looked,
Yeah, Yeah, well, you know, I've heard stories that at the old movie theater downtown, and it was the corner there of Main, and I can't remember, maybe Madison Avenue, but that he would go down there, and in between movies or features, sometimes he would get up and kind of perform there.
Oh, I didn't know
Well,
that.
well, yeah. What that was the Madison Theater, and they had a stage in front of the screen. And on Friday nights, John Sullivan, who was a local radio personality, had a talent show. And so various acts would perform for this contest that he had each week between movies. And I think the grand prize was 2 movie tickets, if I'm not mistaken. But Jimmy pretty much took that over, and he pantomimed Elvis Presley songs. And you know, he could give Elvis a run for his money too, with all the moves and carrying on. But he won it every time. And I think that's where Jimmy really got his start and his taste of show business, was at the Madison Theater with John Sullivan.
Hmm.
Well, I'd heard those stories, but I didn't know if they were true or not. Well, now that we got JP here, let's talk a little bit about the Exiles and how the band formed. And I know, Billy, you said you felt like the big break really came when Action Unlimited went to California, and that opened a spot for you at Speck's. But up until that point, what was the Exiles, and where were you playing, and what were you doing?
Well, we were
Well,
just
go
local.
ahead, JP. Go
We
ahead.
were playing just local places. One I think maybe the first place we ever played, Billy, and you'll have to correct me if I'm wrong, but it was over here at, is it Ephraim McDowell Park over here?
You're right.
Under,
Yeah,
under the picnic shelter?
no, it was actually a maintenance barn. It's still there. They enlarged it and kind of rebuilt it, but it was about 20 by 24 feet. You could hold about 30 people in there.
Mm-hmm.
And it was a place where the lady who was the caretaker at Irvin McDowell decided she was going to put on a dance for the kids. We played there one time, wound up playing there several times.
We did.
Yeah, but it was a very small place.
Well, and what years are we talking about there?
That would have been about 63,
64, maybe 63 or 4, I would
Yeah.
think. Yeah.
Yeah.
So that's kind of when the band got started, 63, 64.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, we formed in 63 as the Fascinations. And that lasted about, I don't know, several months. And there were 2 lead singers, Jimmy Stokely and Ronnie Hall.
Mm-hmm.
And when I joined, Ronnie Hall was really the #1 lead singer. And Ronnie had a velvety smooth voice, and but he was a little bit more on the country side. And Stokely was a screaming, more of a rock and roller. And so when it came time to decide, which way are we going to go here, we more or less decided to go in the rock and roll direction with Stokely, and we actually released Ronnie Hall. But early on, we had 2 singers and different members. But then when Ronnie Hall left, we changed the name. Mac Davenport came up with the name The Exiles, and he actually got that from a book that was written about the Cuban exiles at that time, and we thought that was pretty appropriate because we felt like we were exiled in town because we had long hair, and I guess people looked at us and said, "What are those guys up to?" So, but we changed the name to the Exiles then, and it remained the Exiles until about 73, I guess, and then we dropped the S, and it was just Exile.
Well, I have a question. Did you all ever, in the early days, able to play on the campus at Eastern? Because we were banned from playing on the campus because we played at Speck's. We never had a job where we got paid or even played. Couldn't even practice on the campus. We tried to one time in the music building. We got run out by Mr. Van Pearson. Bill Rouse did that. But did you all able to play on campus?
Early on, we never played at Eastern. And I don't know if there weren't any dances going on or they just didn't want us there. They never told us we were not allowed there, but we didn't play there. But later on, we played there often.
Yeah. Yeah.
We got a note here from John C. Anderson, who is with Action Unlimited, and he said to JP and you guys that they were glad to help give Exile their start by going away.
Well, they were certainly a good influence for us. That's for sure. I mean, I'm being truthful about that. I mean, they were a big deal. Action Unlimited was a really big deal. They really were.
Yeah.
They were I guess they were one of the first bands to break out of a local situation and be seen nationally by the whole country. I guess we were a close second or about the same time, when we started doing the Dick Clark tours, the Caravan of Stars tours. The timeline for me is kind of skewed. I get the years mixed up, but that was all in there real close at the same time frame.
Now, somebody told me, and I think it was Ralph Hacker who told me that the Jimmy Kinser recorded the first album for Exile, maybe even at the radio station, or the closest thing to maybe your first album. Is there any truth to that?
That was not an album; it was a single, and it was actually recorded in his garage behind his house over in Lexington, on his label, which was called Jimbo Records, and we recorded 2 songs on the first go around, and one of them was called "Stay With Me," which was written by. Did Paul Smith write that? I believe he did.
I think he did.
Yeah, he wrote that, and then on the back side of that was a song called "My Three Loves" that Ronnie Hall wrote. It was more of a ballad song, and that was our first recording, and we had to pay to record at that time, and we bought 500 copies, which was the standard package, I guess. And I think that turned out to be about 400 more than we needed. So, but
that brings back memories. Yeah, the Maroons actually recorded on Jimbo, made a record or 2, and I guess Gary Edwards. I'm like JP. I'm kind of fuzzy about all that, what went on back there, but that would have been, I remember that drive. I remember going over there. It had to have been in 1964 for us.
Mm-hmm.
I graduated May of 64 and quit playing at that time.
It was probably
somewhere
65 for us. Yeah, but it was actually just a single, and then we actually did another single there after that one, thinking maybe we'd have more luck with the next recording, but it didn't turn out either. So
was that answer to her prayers?
That was Answer to Her Prayers. Yeah.
I know Paul Smith wrote that. Yeah.
Yes, he did. Yeah. Yeah.
We have a question.
I have copies of all that. I don't have the physical vinyl copies, but I have all of that on CD. Yeah.
Oh, wow. Real quick, let me jump in here. Kathy Rourke Clayton is viewing tonight, and she wants to know if Exile ever played at Alumni Coliseum, maybe as an opening act or something for groups that came in. And I know there was one point where you did the benefit concert for Jimmy toward the end there, and I think he even got to come on stage. But that's the only time that I'm aware of. But you guys obviously would know better than me.
Well, we did. We played Alumni a few times. To me, and Billy, you'll remember this well. We opened. We did a whole tour with Dick Clark, Caravan of Stars. Paul Revere and the Rangers were the closing act, and so happens I booked in Richmond, and we played there. We opened for them at Alumni Coliseum. And to this day, that may be one of the best shows that I've ever been a part of in this band. I mean, it was. Do you remember that reception we got that night, Billy?
Oh, absolutely. We got about a 10-minute standing ovation.
We did.
And I remember when the show was over, Paul Revere said, "You guys stole the show," and literally we did. Of course, it was a hometown crowd, a little home cooking, but it was a great night.
Yeah.
Now, around when was that? When would
67 or 8, maybe?
I think 67.
Yeah.
Or maybe early 68, but yeah, right through there.
Yeah.
But we had that was our third tour with Dick Clark, so we were really comfortable playing in front of large crowds, and you know, we knew all the performers really well, and it was just a big kind of a brotherhood, I guess you could say. And so when we were there, they all knew this was our hometown, and they knew that, you know, we were going to be in front of our hometown people for the first time on this tour, and they gave us a lot of support as well. But it was truly a great homecoming for us.
Yeah.
Yeah, well, what were some of the bigger venues that you guys played when you were out there with the Dick Clark Caravan? I mean, I know you were playing a lot of places, a lot of nights, but do you remember some of the maybe bigger or more famous venues?
Well, they were all big. I
Yeah.
mean, they were, Paul Revere and the Raiders were such a huge act, and the whole show package was such a big success and so popular. I mean, we played, I mean, everywhere we went, we played in the biggest venues that the city had. You know, most of them don't exist anymore, you know, like Mid-South Coliseum and Memphis and you know, Diddle Arena down at Western. I don't know if that's still in operation.
It's still there, yeah.
Yeah. But we played, I mean, that show could, I mean, if Rupp Arena had been built, it would have filled Rupp Arena. You know, we played all the places.
Yeah, Alumni was actually one of the smaller venues on the tours that we went on. Most of them were much larger than Alumni Coliseum, and almost all of them were full every night. Paul Revere and the Raiders had an afternoon TV show on ABC at that time called Where the Action Is, and it was a Dick Clark production, but they were very, very, very popular on the TV show as well as all of their recordings. So they were probably at the very top of the heap at that point, wouldn't you say, JP?
Yeah.
I mean, they were probably the hottest group in the country at that time.
They were. It gave us exposure, really, like we had never had before. And it, you know,
Was that
it taught us the difference between playing for, you know, 50 people at the park shelter to 15,000. You know, there is a big difference. But but they were always very gracious to us and supportive. And you know, we before those tours, I mean, we'd never really done anything very big before at all. And that support they gave us really helped us a whole lot. It really did. Gave us a lot of confidence.
And that was Mark Lindsay, wasn't he the voice of the Raiders at that time, Paul Revere and the Raiders?
He was. After the show in Richmond, Paul Revere asked us to come to his room, which the Holiday Inn was booked for the tour, Holiday Inn here in town at the time. And so when we got back to there, we went to his room to see what was going on. And he and Mark Lindsay were in there, and they offered us a management contract. They wanted to manage us. And it just so happened that at that time we had 2 or 3 other irons in the fire, basically based out of New York. And we gave it some serious consideration, but we felt like we'd be better off with an established manager. He hadn't managed anyone, Paul Revere hadn't. And so we really didn't, I guess, feel real comfortable going with him. Just, you know, yeah, they were stars. At that time, did they know anything about managing a band? So we basically explained to him, and he understood, and everything was fine. But they wanted to manage us and made us a nice offer and a very good presentation in their discussion. But they really just didn't have any management experience, and we were looking for some established management firm, which we found.
Now, we have a note here from Scott Whitson, one of our alums up in the Ashland area, and he says he can remember Exile blowing rare earth away at the Louisville Downs the night before the Derby one year and said Stokely was on fire that night. Do you remember playing before the Derby?
I remember that
do.
show. I don't remember us blowing rare earth away though. But I do remember we used to play one of those Derby shows just about every year.
Uh-huh.
Yeah.
Well, JP, you mentioned the name Paul Smith a couple of times, and we had some folks asking, tell us a little bit more about Paul Smith. Was he part of the Exiles?
Yeah, Paul was one of the original members. Paul played, I think Paul played bass with Ronnie and the Fascinations, which preceded, the Exiles. When we decided to form the Exiles, Paul switched over to guitar, and I came in as the bass player. Billy has a little bit more of a history of Paul than I do. Has known him a little bit longer. So Billy,
Paul was really probably responsible for the group as it wound up being, because there were about 4 people who started the Fascinations, and actually Mac Davenport was one of the members of the Fascinations. He was the drummer, but Paul kind of, I guess I should say, he kind of led us in the direction that we went, and he was a very solid member, and he wound up getting drafted and went to Vietnam. But up until then, I really thought he was responsible for a lot of our music and all that. Then once we added a few more members, then it wasn't quite as much. But early on, he was a driving force.
Well, that's one of the things that, as a fan of Exile over the years, that I have come to appreciate. And obviously, the band still tours today as Exile. And when you guys play, JP, you guys that are still in the band, and you play at Renfro Valley or somewhere close by, and these guys like Billy and Mac and Mike and some of those guys are there, you usually somehow find a way to recognize them and to acknowledge them, because the band has a long history, and you guys are as close today as you were 40 years ago.
Well, we'd be sorely remiss if we didn't recognize them, because if it weren't for them, we wouldn't be there in the first place. So we try to embarrass them just as much as we possibly can by making them stand up. And we even got them up on stage with us down at Renfro Valley one year. I
think a couple years, yeah.
It was sort of a knee-jerk thing. We had to have you up there. I wanted everybody to see you all, and I think everybody really, really enjoyed that a lot. You may have been there, Dan. I'm not sure, but
yeah,
that was very special, very special.
Well, and one of the things, and JP, you and I have talked about this a little bit, is one of the things that the band has released is kind of an album, and I don't know if anybody calls it an album still. I still do, but called the Garage Tapes, which are a lot of tapes from, and I don't know when those were recorded, but it's a lot of stuff that wasn't recorded on fancy recording material, but just recorded in a garage.
Yeah, that's actually a double CD. It's 30 songs, and most of the recordings on there are from about 79 up through right around 1983. We had gone off the road, and in the interim, we're working on trying to get a country recording career together. And we were playing at a local bar over in Lexington, a place called the Rebel Room, which is in Southland Bowling Lanes. But those 2 or 3 years there, we used to go in this little garage studio over there and just make sort of rudimentary recordings of new songs, to have to pitch to prospective record labels and so on and so forth. And the lion's share of that album are recordings from that studio, which we recorded them and produced them ourselves. And there are other tracks on there, like there are some rehearsal tracks that were recorded on just a boombox sitting down in front of the band, which I think are a lot more interesting than any of the studio recordings, you know. But some of those recordings ended up being recorded again on master sessions and later albums that turned out to be hits for us. And I was a little bit leery of releasing that because the recordings are just so archaic. You know, they're just about as lo-fi as you can get. But as it turns out, we gotten a lot of mileage out of that. People seem to really, really enjoy just the rawness of it, and it's done really well for us.
Now, when you guys think back to those early days in the 60s, and then as you started to make it bigger in the 70s and even into the late 70s with Kiss You All Over and everything, but even today, there are still at least a couple of numbers from those early days that you guys still include and played. And I think of Church Street Revival is the one that comes to my mind. You guys played that song for a long time, right? I mean, it was one of the early songs of the band, maybe?
Yeah. I mean, Church Street Soul Revival was about the closest thing you can come to having a hit that wasn't actually a hit. It was a big hit around here and around the region, but it made quite a bit of noise nationally, but not quite enough to take it over the top. We don't play it anymore. We haven't played it for years.
Okay.
I wish we did. I wish we did. I kind of hesitate to play it without Jimmy singing. You know, I guess I'm being a sentimental or whatever. But
that song was released on Columbia label, and they have a great promotion team, and everything was in place. Every market that it was played in, it went #1. But the problem was it didn't have any impact because it was scattered. So, for instance, Washington, D.C. may have it #1 on their chart this week, and then by the time Kansas City gets it to #1 on their chart, it's already faded in Washington. So it was hitting sporadically, and we didn't get the overall impact that we needed to actually make it a hit record. It was really a hit record, in my opinion, but it just didn't fall in place. So it's one of those things.
Well, who wrote that song?
Tommy James, off Tommy John Dale's.
And he produced.
We played a show with him. Was it in Baton Rouge? Wasn't it?
It was. Yes.
We opened a show for him. I mean, it's when Tommy was just huge. He was a huge star, and he liked the band, and he said he had a song. Isn't that the way it went, Billy? Said he had a song that he thought that would really suit us, and he wanted to produce it. And one thing led to another. We went to New York and recorded it in the studio up there with Tommy. And I'm not sure if Tommy was instrumental in helping us get a record deal with Columbia. Is that the way it worked?
Yeah. Well, actually, our management company at the time, our manager's name was Mark Allen, and he had been a booking agent with Premier Talent, which was the largest booking agency in the country at that time. And we had auditioned for Columbia just before this. And when Mark Allen realized this bit about Tommy James, he went to Clive Davis, who was the president of Columbia Records. And they said, yeah, let's do it. So as JP said, they brought us into the studio, and we recorded that and a couple of other songs. And then it went from there. But we just didn't really have a lot of luck on Columbia, unfortunately.
Yeah, I remember we drove straight from Richmond, Kentucky to that studio in New York City, stayed up all day and all night recording those couple of songs, and jumped in the car, drove straight back.
Yeah.
Hey, George, I want to keep you in the conversation here. I'm sorry. I tried to hit the Maroons early before JP got here. So
I
we
want
can
to hear
talk a
some
little bit
stuff
about
about
that.
the Maroons.
Well, the Maroons, what I was sitting here listening to their stories, and I followed them and been very impressed with how they've been able to stay together all these years. I just wish Gary Edwards was alive because now, see, I graduated from Eastern and we had our start at Speck's, and Gary kept playing, and Bill Ralph was their lead guitar player, and Larry Joe True, the bass player, went with Gary. And Gary, then they called their band the Embers. They were big time in Louisville. And that's when Gary met up with Sherry and become Gary and Sherry Edwards and the Embers, and they played all over everywhere. And Gary used to always give credit back to Speck's, and Gary stayed totally in touch with Frank and Joanne Nocita all the time, and would call them, and Frank and Joanne would call Gary. But now Gary went on to do some big time stuff. He was the opening act for Kenny Rogers out in Las Vegas. He did some of the cruise ships, but he just never could get a break to get at a point where he would, you'd hear about him. But he stayed in show business all his life, and the rest of us kind of dropped out of the wayside as far as trying to do it professionally. Larry True and Bill Ralph, we all got back together about 15 years ago and did some playing. And the Maroons kind of in '64 kind of ended the Maroons. And Speck's was the place that got our start, and the other bands, like I say, it morphed into Action Unlimited. That's how it took off.
Well, George, you brought up a good point. You mentioned that the Maroons kind of got back together 15 years ago or so. One of the things that has happened since Speck's closed several times over the years is what I'll call Speck's reunions. And Durwood Hale kind of mentioned this in the chat, giving thanks to Muff Adams, a guy named Muff Adams. He kind of helped organize those for years, right?
Yeah, they had several of those. Muff's Farm one time, and then down at Gravel Switch. And I was busy working, and I didn't participate in any of those. But then we all got back together at Eastern at one in 2011, and had.
I wish I'd seen that. Wow.
Yeah. And Gary couldn't come back at that time, but he come back a year or so later. We actually performed out at the winery out on Barnes Mill Road. But some of the older players, and then Dewey Pope had a band, and like I say, Dewey wrote a book about all this that links the Exiles and gives everybody credit and goes back to the Speck's and the start he got at Eastern. And Dewey actually graduated from Eastern. But when they went out to California, they had quite a run. And maybe not get Dewey on this show sometime to talk about Action Unlimited out in California, because they were opening acts for some of the big bands back then. Got to always start right at Speck's. That's the kind of key for all these groups.
Yeah, and that's one of the reasons I think that so many people remember Speck's and have that attraction to Speck's, that fondness for Speck's, because it did launch a lot of bands, and it was probably the first and only of its kind at that time. Speaking of books, Billy, I want to mention, and I don't know if this is something that's going to go on forever, but you're working on a book, right?
I am. I'm in the final stages of it, but I don't know how long I'll still be in the final stages. But it's developed real nicely, yeah. And it tells a lot of the stories we're telling now, and it I hope is a real accurate history of the band from its inception through when Stokely left. Or actually when he passed away. So it kind of takes you up to that time. And then after that, JP and the band kind of changed musical direction. But my book is more about the Jimmy Stokely era of the band. So.
Well, and George, you mentioned that Gary Edwards was one of those guys who never could really get that big break. And I guess for Exile, the big break was Kiss You All Over, right? I mean, that's when, I mean, not that you had made it pretty big at that point, but Kiss You All Over changed everything, right?
It did. It did. We'd never had a national hit before. We were starting to refer to ourselves as when Kiss You All Over hit, we started referring to ourselves as a 15-year overnight success, just to try to be funny, but all of the work that went into getting there in those 15 years was just monumental by a lot of people. You know, people like Billy and Jimmy and Mac and Mike and Buzz and Bernie, but you know, even as big a song as that was, we had a hard time following it. I think it was probably a little bit too big, you know. And we kept putting out single after single, and with no success. And in the interim, we were having some success as writers with country artists. Artists from Nashville started hearing our songs on some of our pop albums and taking them and recording them and having hits with them, you know, on their own. So we kind of created a little buzz as writers in Nashville. So I guess the next move for us, logical move, was to try to fashion ourselves as a country act. You know, that all happened, and it's kind of kept us going, and it's kept us going to this day.
And you know, I really thought that Heart and Soul was that song. I really thought it and obviously Huey Lewis had a big hit with it many years later, but that song had all the makings of a pop hit for sure.
Well, we were real positive about that song when we cut it. We thought it sounded like a hit. It was a hit, just not by us, you know. So, but it became Huey Lewis's first #1 song. We ran into him at one of the American Music Awards shows about a year after that, and he said, "Man, thank you guys." You know, he was very humble, and he was really thankful that to be able to get the song. And he said, "Well, we cut it like you guys did. I don't know what the difference is, but thank you so much. It just made us feel good, you know."
Well, we did have a couple of other questions that I want to try to get to, and I had a couple of notes of some last minute things as I'm looking through here. One thing I do want to talk about, and just we started tonight with Specs, and I kind of want us to as we start to finish talk about Specs too. But each of you, if you could kind of just in your memory, what was it that made Specs special or different? What was it about Specs that made it the place that it was, that so many people still remember so fondly?
Well, I'll be glad to
Go ahead, George.
here, because 1960, when I left Middlesboro, Kentucky, and come to Eastern, was kind of the first time I'd been out of, anywhere much out of the mountains. And my first exposure down at Specs as a student at Eastern it was just a fun place. Everybody was in there. Back then, though, the jukebox was still a big on some nights. The night that we heard Nicky Zane and Chuck Campbell and them playing as a rock and roll band, and all the kids were dancing, it had some kind of impact on me, because I'd been in a high school band and played marches, and I didn't know anything about playing a trap set. So that after my freshman year, I went back to Middlesboro. I worked in the summer, but I acquired a set of drums. And so the impact Specs had on me was that I think all my education at Eastern, how important that was, but I got a real education of how to deal with people, get along with people, hard work of being in a band, and all the friendships. And to this day, Larry True and I, we were roommates at Eastern. By the way, we were in O'Donnell Hall my freshman year, and there was 3 to a room, and the room was only designed for 2 people. We were crammed in, and I don't know, but Eastern had a big buildup there in the early 60s. But Larry True and I talked to him yesterday, and Larry and I are friends, and he started out as a guitar player, but he went to a bass player and become a very good bass player.
He was one of my heroes, Larry was.
Yeah, Larry still got his old original bass that we all paid $10 a month at Lexington Music Store over there. I'm trying to think of the name of it. You all know there was a big one that let you buy something.
Carl's,
Carl's.
That don't sound right, but that might
Don Wilson.
Don Wilson. Don
Yeah.
Wilson Music Company.
Yeah.
The singers would buy microphones and things. We'd pay them $5, $10, $15 a month. But Larry True has original bass. That's one of those kind that now is worth $25,000, $30,000. He's got the case and the sound of that bass back that he bought then compared to when you hear a bass today. And JP, you'd know what I'm talking about. They just something about old basses that were built in the late 50s and early 60s.
Yeah. It was a Fender. It was a Fender Precision. I used to go see Larry. The band, but as a bass player myself in those days, I was really focused on what Larry was doing. He was great.
Yeah.
I saw the band, I forget what year it was, 2 or 3 different times in the span of about a month one summer. And Larry was playing with just 3 strings. You know, basses have 4 strings. Larry had broken a string, and I don't know if you remember that or not, but he didn't replace the broken string and just played on 3. So I thought, this guy's really talented. He's more talented than even I thought he was, you know. But yeah, he was my hero.
He probably didn't have an extra string with him, and I can remember the guitar players' string would break and right in the middle of the song or something, and everybody'd have to keep on going. And saxophone would pick it up, or the organ player, Tommy Coggin on our organ had a big old Wurlitzer. But you all had the same problem when you played at Speck's. It was kind of simple to get in and out. We've laughed about places we played where we had to carry those instruments upstairs where there were no elevators.
Yeah.
Work that you put in setting up the play and all the work to take down and driving back from out when you played in Lebanon out there, driving back to Richmond, get home 4 or 5 o'clock in the morning.
Yeah, the actual playing was the easy part. It was
That's exactly right.
Up and tearing down, trying to get home. That was the hard part.
But nothing but good memories about Speck's. And I think it was the atmosphere and Frank and Joanne Nacita and all the people that we met and just become good friends with them. And I'm just Exile, all those kind of talk about us as the group that
Speck's wasn't
older.
Yeah, Speck's was it was the only place where college kids and young local kids could go to see a live band and feel safe.
Yeah, that's what
they had that going for them, and you guys probably went over all this, but I mean, you had to have you either had an 18-year-old stamp or you had a 21-year-old stamp. If you were 18, you couldn't buy beer. If you had an 18-year-old stamp, you couldn't buy beer, and if you had a 21-year-old stamp, you could. But that never really stopped anybody from having a beer. You know, it was kind of an inexact science they had going on there. It was a wonderful place.
Billy, what about you? What are the things you remember?
I think George kind of summed it up pretty well. I think Speck's was a place that you grew up. You learned how to be an adult, and even though you weren't old enough to drink, you learned how to drink. You learned how to socialize, and on top of that, it was really the only place you could go to socialize in this area. And I mean, I learned a lot there, and I think everybody else did as well. And it was well managed and maintained, like we talked about. And I think all in all, it was just a place you grew up.
I don't know. I don't know if they had if there was even any such position as fire marshal in those days, because I mean, you guys know. I mean, that place held about, I don't know, maybe 250 people. There'd be 600 people in there. It was unreal, man. It was unreal.
Yeah, we've talked about how it kept from falling in, and the thing, and I can still see the kids jumping up when we'd request. We'd have to play it sometimes 2 or 3 times, jump up and shout, and when they would jump up, and the building would seem like it was moving, even though it was up on the stage, and how it kept from falling in. The kids had so much fun. And
Yeah.
I commented earlier, a friend of mine, Butch Yeary, every night that it was open, he said the bands, but he said everybody had happy feet there. That was his memory of Specs was everybody up dancing. You didn't have nobody sitting around like a lot of dances we played. Sometimes we'd play a whole set, nobody would dance. These young
Yeah.
high school kids, boy, there at Specs, everybody was up dancing and having a big time.
It must have been 200 degrees in there. I mean,
Oh yeah, oh yeah.
air conditioning, and they just opened a few windows. And that was
Open the windows. That was it.
the AC, you know.
What I remember.
Yeah.
Well, guys, I appreciate you being with us tonight, and I don't want to take up the entire night. I've loved getting to go down memory lane with you guys and talk about Specs and the Maroons and the Exiles, and it's been a lot of fun. Are there any final thoughts that you guys want to share as we start to wrap up tonight?
Well, I do. There is a nice book about the Exiles that was written by Randy Westbrook. It is for sale. And there's another book that Dewey Pope wrote about Action Unlimited. And he gives credit to the Exiles. Both these books refer to Specs and the young and the start they got and how good Frank Nicita was to all the different bands, the Monzas, and there's several other groups that played there. But that's if anybody's interested in knowing about the history of the Exiles, I'm looking forward to Billy's book. But there's two books right now that you can purchase that cover those time periods and gives all the talk about everybody. So I've read them and encourage everybody to read one if they want.
There's actually another book too, George, that Nicole Lamar, which is Sonny Lamar's daughter. Sonny's the bass player in Exile. And she wrote a really nice book about the band too that takes it pretty much from inception to present.
Oh, I'd like to see that. Yeah. Well, thank you for mentioning that.
Yeah.
The name of it is Life in Exile.
Oh, okay. Have to get a copy of that.
Great. JP, Billy, any final thoughts for tonight?
Well, I'm just tickled to see such response online here. That's really. I'm glad to see so many people have tuned into the broadcast and hey everybody, God bless you all. Miss you all. I know probably more than half of you, but it's good. It's good to see that people are enjoying this, and I want to do it again.
Well, we will. We definitely will. We're going to be doing it all week, but we may make this a regular part of homecoming every year. Who knows? And get back together and talk about and change the focus a little bit every year, but get back together and talk some more. Billy, final thoughts from you?
Well, I just thank you for presenting this, and I really appreciate everybody who went to Specs and who graduated from Eastern. I think it's just great all the way around, and I'm honored to be a part of it.
Well, and Billy, you're going to be back with us on Wednesday night when we get to the 80s, and we'll talk about Jay Sutters and your second wave with Richmond downtown. So I'm looking forward to that.
I would like to say thank you to the Alumni Association for coming up with this idea. This virus has got everybody trying to learn how to present, and I just hope all the Eastern alumni will help support Eastern and all of us. And it's just a great opportunity to talk about this. And thank you, Danny, for inviting me to be a part of it. And like I say, I wish some of the other guys that are still around could participate sometime in the future.
Well, we'll definitely look at doing it again, and I cannot say thank you enough to you guys. You have made tonight a lot of fun for me, and I know for a lot of other people who were tuned in. So, JP, George, Billy, thank you for being with us tonight.
Thank you, Dan.
Thanks for having us.
Bye-bye.
Take care.
All right, that wraps up tonight's session, the 1960s and Specs. Don't forget, we're going to be here all week long. Tomorrow night, it's the 1970s, and we're going to talk a little bit about Pupiazzi's and the Bear and the Bull and Dirty Ernie's and some of those places. Of course, Specs even went into the early 1970s. And we're also going to spend our second hour tomorrow night talking about some of the places where people of color in this town could go for nightlife and entertainment. We'll talk about the Magic Moment, which Willie Joe Covington has owned for many, many years and still owns today, which is located in Richmond and some of the other places like that. We've got some great guests lined up for tomorrow night, and we really hope that you will tune back in tomorrow night starting at 7, and we'll be here every night this week. We'll do the 80s on Wednesday, the 90s on Thursday, and then even into the 2000s on Friday. I also want to remind you we do have pub crawl shirts, and this is going to be a collector's item, so you want to make sure and get one. There's going to be a link that'll show you how to do that as we wrap up the show tonight. We want to hear from you so you can register and mark that you joined us for tonight, and hopefully you'll be able to come back and join us another night later in the week. But we'll have some of that information as the show wraps up tonight. You'll be able to see the links. And of course, homecoming is coming up in October. We cannot get together on campus this year, but we are going to do some follow-up programming to what we do this week with the pub crawl during homecoming week, and keep your eyes open for information on that. So that will wrap us up for tonight. We thank you for watching. We hope you join us again as the week continues. The Eternal Colonel Virtual Pub Crawl from EKU. Good night, everyone.